So now we understand the histology, or the microscopic anatomy, of how the tissue is arranged in bones. It's time to look at the physiology of the osseous tissue. That is, how does it function and what are all of its hormonal controls? So it's probably evident now that even when bone is fully formed, it remains metabolically active and it has many roles to play. It's involved in its own maintenance of growth and remodeling, and has a profound influence over the rest of the body by exchanging minerals like calcium with the tissue fluid. Disturbances of calcium homeostasis in the skeleton will disrupt the function of other organ systems, and it has an especially large effect on the nervous and muscular systems. Mineral deposition is a crystallization process in which calcium phosphate and other ions are taken from the blood plasma and deposited into the bone tissue. Osteoblasts, again, were the cells that are producing bone matrix. They produce helical collagen fibers. Remember, the collagen fibers are analogous to the rebar in our concrete building. They form these fibers along the length of the osteon. These fibers will then become encrusted with minerals that harden the matrix. The major mineral is hydroxyapatite. It's a combination of calcium and phosphate, and it's brought in from the blood plasma. Most tissues have inhibitors that prevent the formation of hydroxyapatite. However, osteoblasts have a substance that will neutralize these inhibitors, so it allows the formation of crystals. Once a few crystals or seed crystals form, those will attract more calcium and more phosphate, and the tissue will quickly become crystallized. Now, sometimes the inhibitors for the formation of hydroxyapatite don't work, and you might have abnormal calcification or ectopic calcification. This can occur sometimes in the lungs, in the brain, in the eyes, sometimes in muscles, tendons, or arteries, in the example of arteriosclerosis. The name we give to calcification of an otherwise soft organ is called a calculus. So while osteoblasts are depositing minerals in the bone, osteoclasts break down bone tissue, and thus they're involved in mineral resorption. Now, keep in mind, mineral resorption, it's not reabsorption, it's resorption into the blood. So this is the process of dissolving bone and releasing the minerals into the blood. The opposite of deposition, where we're taking minerals from the blood and depositing them in the bone. Remember, the osteoclasts have this ruffled border, and they have hydrogen pumps in the membrane on the ruffled border, and it secretes hydrogen into the space between the osteoclast and the bone surface. Chloride ions naturally follow by electrical attraction. Hydrogens are positive, chlorides are negatives. This means that we form hydrochloric acid in that ruffled border space. This hydrochloric acid has a pH of about 4, and it's going to dissolve the bone minerals. Then we'll see acid phosphatase, which is an enzyme that digests the collagen. So osteoclasts do two things. They digest the rebar, the collagen, as well as digesting the bone minerals with hydrochloric acid. Now, we frequently use orthodontic appliances like braces to reposition our teeth. The tooth moves because of a balance of osteoclast and osteoblast activity. When you're pulling on the tooth, the osteoclasts are going to dissolve the bone ahead of the tooth where the pressure on the bone is the greatest. And then osteoblasts actually deposit more bone slowly in the lower pressure zone behind the tooth. This causes the tooth to actually be permanently moved by the braces. That's pretty cool. So calcium and phosphate are used in many processes. We'll find phosphate in things like DNA, RNA, ATP, phospholipids, and of course pH buffers. And calcium is needed for neuron communication and muscle contraction, as well as blood clotting and the process of exocytosis. Where does this calcium all come from? Well, our skeleton is a huge reservoir. In fact, we have over a kilogram of calcium in the adult body. 99% of that is in the skeleton. Most of it as that compound called hydroxyapatite. That's calcium and phosphate crystallized together. And it's not very easily exchanged with the blood, except until the osteoclasts will release it. Less than 1% of the calcium in the skeleton is actually exchangeable and easily released into tissue fluid for use. But that still results in about 18% of the adult skeleton, the mineral component, being exchanged with the blood each year. Imagine that 18% of your skeletal minerals will end up in your blood each year. That means we need to be able to replace it. So dietary calcium intake is very important. So in the blood plasma, the normal calcium concentration is about 9.2 to 10.4 milligrams per deciliter. 45% of that is just as Ca2+, and it can diffuse across capillary walls and affect other tissues. The rest of it is bound to plasma proteins as it circulates through the body. If we have not enough calcium in the blood, it's called hypocalcemia. This causes excitability of muscles, tremors, spasms, or the inability for muscles to relax. When we investigate the function of muscle contraction, we'll see where that comes into play. It causes sodium to enter the cells too easily and excites the nerves and muscles. When the blood calcium is too high, we'll see that the sodium channels are much less responsive and nerves and muscles are much less excitable than normal. People will be sluggish and depressed. That's the condition of hypercalcemia. Hyper, a lot, calcium, emia in the blood. So hypercalcemia is relatively rare because we have so many mechanisms in place to maintain homeostasis, putting extra calcium into the bone and removing excess from the blood into the feces. We can keep calcium in balance pretty well. Hypocalcemia, though, is much more frequent. It can result from vitamin D deficiency because vitamin D is necessary for transporting calcium into the bones. Diarrhea because we lose calcium in our feces. If there's extra feces, we'll have extra calcium loss. Sometimes we'll see it with thyroid tumors or underactive parathyroid. Soon you'll learn that the parathyroid gland produces parathyroid hormone, and that's involved in calcium balance. During pregnancy and lactation, we're giving a lot of calcium off to the fetus, and so we might see the mother's calcium levels go low. Also, on occasion, during thyroid surgeries, the parathyroid glands are accidentally removed. That results in less parathyroid hormone and thus less calcium into the blood. So calcium homeostasis depends on a balance between dietary intake of calcium, urinary and fecal losses of calcium, and the exchanges between this reservoir in the bones or osseous tissue. So how is the homeostasis of these calcium ions regulated? There are three primary players. There's calcitriol, calcitonin, and parathyroid hormone. These are the hormones involved in maintenance of normal blood calcium concentration. This figure will really help us understand the functions of each of those. Let's look at them one at a time. We'll flip back and forwards. So calcitriol is the activated form of vitamin D. It's produced by sequential action of the skin, the liver, and the kidneys. And it's a hormone that will raise blood calcium. So anything that's involved in adding calcium to the blood, calcitriol could mediate. Primarily, it's going to increase calcium absorption by the small intestine and increase calcium resorption, that is from the bones, into the blood. The way that it increases calcium resorption is that the stem cells will increase in their differentiation into osteoclasts. As the osteoclasts become more active, they release more calcium and phosphate from the bone into the blood. Calcitriol also promotes kidney reabsorption of calcium ions, so less of it is lost in the urine. Let's take a look at that. So here we'll see calcitriol. Calcitriol is increasing absorption of calcium from the digestive tract and into the blood. Here's the blood. And increasing kidneys' retention of calcium so that we keep more in the blood. We also see that calcitriol is involved in resorption by the osteoclasts. So osteoclasts release calcium from the bone and put it into the blood. So calcitriol is necessary to raise blood calcium. And in order to have bone deposition, we need to have a high level of calcium and phosphate. So calcitriol then is necessary for bone deposition. Even though it's involved in bone resorption, it's necessary to get enough calcium in from the dietary end and prevent its departure through the kidneys and colon so that we have enough that we could do calcium deposition. That condition of rickets that we looked at earlier results from not having enough vitamin D. Now you can think of this. Vitamin D is known as vitamin D subscript 3, hence the calcitriol. So let's take a little bit of a closer look at the production of calcitriol. So the epidermal keratinocytes in the skin are going to convert a form of cholesterol into pre-vitamin D3. And then the liver will convert that pre-vitamin D3 into calcidiol. The kidneys will then convert the calcidiol into calcitriol. Okay, so quickly, jot down all the things you can remember that calcitriol does. Remember that this hormone is all about raising blood calcium levels. What 3 points could you help aid in raising blood calcium levels? Then we can move on to look at calcitonin. Calcitonin is another hormone that's secreted by the C cells or the clear cells of the thyroid gland. And it's secreted when blood calcium levels rise too high. It lowers calcium concentration in 2 ways. First of all, it's going to inhibit osteoclasts. Now remember, osteoclasts break down tissue and release calcium into the blood. So if we inhibit their activity with calcitonin, then there will be less calcium liberated from the bones and thus lower levels in the blood. Calcitonin also stimulates osteoblast activity. What do osteoblasts do? Remember that osteoblasts are depositing minerals into the bone, including calcium. So if we increase the number of osteoblasts and increase their activity, then we're going to be drawing more calcium out of the blood and depositing it into the bones. Now, this calcitonin is very important in children. It has a very profound effect. However, it has a much weaker effect in adults. The reason for this is that osteoclasts in children are much more active because their bones are growing and there's a lot faster remodeling going. As we increase the bones in diameter, osteoclasts are chewing them up, and osteoblasts are laying down more bone. So osteoblast activity will predominate in children. Calcitonin is also responsible for reducing bone loss in women during pregnancy and lactation, because again, it'll increase the osteoblast activity, so her own bones are drawing more minerals into them. So what happens when we see hypercalcemia, excess calcium in the blood here? It causes calcitonin secretion, Calcitonin secretion is going to reduce the osteoclast activity and increase osteoblast activity, which results in there being less bone resorption, that is, minerals being drawn back into the blood, and more bone deposition, so more minerals are drawn out of the blood, which then returns blood calcium levels to normal. So again, jot down all the functions you can remember for calcitonin. This figure might help you sort it out. Calcitonin is going to be involved in deposition of minerals into the bones by osteoblasts and concurrent inhibition of osteoclasts. So make sure you have those things clear. Now, parathyroid hormone, a third hormone that's involved in calcium regulation. It's released by the parathyroid gland when blood calcium levels are low. Thus, it acts to raise calcium blood level. It does this in 4 different ways. First of all, it's going to bind to receptors on osteoblasts, and it causes the release of a chemical messenger that's called rankle. Don't worry too much about what that means for now. But this messenger raises the osteoclast population, and of course will promote bone reabsorption. It also promotes calcium reabsorption by the kidneys. That means we'll lose less calcium in the urine, and thus more is maintained in the blood. Parathyroid hormone is involved in the final step of calcitriol synthesis in the kidneys. So the presence of parathyroid hormone will increase the rate of calcitriol synthesis, and thus will cause the calcium levels in the blood to rise. Finally, parathyroid hormone inhibits collagen synthesis by the osteoblasts. In this manner, it's inhibiting bone deposition and thus raising calcium levels in the blood because we're not pulling minerals out of the blood. So parathyroid hormone in very low levels can also stimulate bone deposition. So at high levels, we're raising blood calcium and inhibiting bone deposition, thus leaving more calcium in the blood. And at low levels, we'll see that parathyroid hormone can also cause bone deposition and be used to increase bone mass. If we look at this figure and we see a blood calcium deficiency, we'll note parathyroid hormone has all 4 of these effects. So these figures are very good at summarizing the roles of each of these hormones. If we increase osteoclast activity, we'll see more bone resorption, more minerals being brought into the blood. If we'll see reduced osteoblast activity, and thus we see less bone deposition that works in contrast to the resorption. We'll see more urinary phosphate excretion. With more urinary phosphate excretion, we can form less hydroxyapatite because we need both calcium and phosphate. And that leads to having more calcium in the blood because it can't be bound up as hydroxyapatite. So again, jot down all the functions that you can remember for parathyroid hormone. We've got 4 different things that it does. Now that you have the functions of each of these 3 hormones outlined, put together a diagram of how they interact. Perhaps it'll be similar to this one, showing how calcitriol, calcitonin, and parathyroid hormone act together to maintain normal blood calcium concentration. Or it may look like a combination of these types of figures, showing how each of the hormones act to regulate blood calcium levels. It's your choice. Depends how you see things more clearly. So now we've addressed calcium homeostasis, it's time to take a look at phosphate homeostasis. The average adult has about 500 to 800 grams of phosphorus. It's almost a little more than a pound. 85 to 90% of the phosphate is stored in the bones. The normal plasma concentrations are about 3.5 to 4.0 milligrams per deciliter. Phosphate occurs in two principal forms, HPO4 2- and H2PO4. These are correspondingly called monohydrogen and dihydrogen phosphate. The level of phosphate is not regulated nearly as tightly as calcium because there's no immediate functional disorders resulting from a slight change in the blood phosphate levels. Calcitriol is involved in its absorption by the small intestine, just as it is involved in calcium absorption. Thus, it promotes bone deposition. Parathyroid hormone has an impact on phosphate too. It lowers phosphate by promoting its urinary secretion. Remember, parathyroid hormone does not promote excretion of calcium. It promotes reabsorption of calcium from the urine. And so as we lose more phosphate in the urine and maintain more calcium, less hydroxyapatite can form because there's less phosphate available to do that. And so it aids to prevent deposition of hydroxyapatite in the bones. So I know this seems like a lot of information, but all this hormonal regulation, that's the physiology part of this course. I find it fascinating. The more you understand, the more curious you'll become, and the more excited you'll become about the material. So really do spend some time figuring out the relationships of each of these hormones. We're just scratching the surface. There are 20 or more different hormones, vitamins, and growth factors that affect osseous tissue, and we're not going to address them in the context of this course. But know that there's a lot more going on than even we're looking at. Now, bone growth is especially rapid in puberty and adolescence, so we'll see surges of hormones like estrogen and testosterone. Both of these hormones also promote ossification. We know that girls grow faster than boys and reach their full height much earlier. That's because estrogen has a much stronger effect than testosterone on bone growth. However, males grow for a longer time and eventually become taller. Anabolic steroids will actually cause growth to stop. It causes the epiphyseal plates to close prematurely, and thus an individual who takes anabolic steroids before they've reached their full growth potential will experience a stunted growth and abnormally short adult stature. This table summarizes most of the hormones and growth factors that are involved in calcium and bone metabolism. Take a look through it, but you're not going to be held responsible for anything more than calcitriol, calcitonin, and parathyroid hormone, as well as knowing that the impacts of estrogen and testosterone.